All right. Hey, everyone. Thanks for joining the Earthshot podcast again. Today I have Eron Bloomgarden, who's the founder and CEO at Emergent, the nonprofit behind the Leaf Coalition, and also climate finance, and who also worked on the first carbon ETF KRBN. So, really deep history in this space, and really excited to have you on today. Thanks for joining.
Great to be here, Troy.
Mm, we always start with just a little bit of an intro story. How did you get into this space? What are a few things that you've done? Because I know a lot of people listening, maybe they're investors, maybe they're developers, maybe they're in the industry, but a lot are also not and wondering how to find their way in. So maybe just give a little background on how you got into this field and what are some things that you've done.
Yeah. Uh, Maybe this ages me, but I'll start. Look, I after when I graduated college, I was involved in the early days of, let's say, we used to call it .com 1.0, right? So the internet revolution back in the late 90s. And I was heading in that direction, probably heading into business school, and looking at grad schools, and then living in New York City, and 9/11 hit, and I think, like a lot of people, we kind of reassessed what we wanted to devote our lives to, and that was certainly the case with me. And I had been increasingly interested and passionate about environmental issues, just being outdoors, spending a lot of time outdoors um, as a hiker and also as a surfer, and I decided to sort of rededicate myself into that path, and to use the skills and knowledge as they were at the time in business, in the service of the environment. And so I found a program at Columbia University at the School of International Public Affairs. It was an MPA, Environmental Science and Policy. Signed up for that. I want to say at a whim. There was a little more thought. It was a little more thoughtful than that, but that was the beginning of the journey. And at that time, it was before the Kyoto Protocol had been ratified. It was in the very early days of the Clean Development Mechanism, the CDM being kind of developed. And I kind of got exposed to it as a school project. I knew going into grad school that I wanted to bring the tools of business and the tools of finance to bear on solving the greatest environmental challenges of the day. And I quickly gravitated towards climate, and then of course carbon markets, and more broadly kind of ecosystem services and pricing environmental attributes. And so upon graduating, I went to work at a firm called Eco Securities, which was a small consulting firm, about 20 people back in the day. And this was at the very early stages of the CDM, and I had the opportunity there to develop first as a consultant. We evolved at a company into really, from a consulting company really to project development and investment company. But I really had the opportunity there to develop the first, CDM, some of the first CDM projects in the world. I spent, several years traveling through Latin America, Asia, a bit in Africa, originating and developing carbon offset projects, right, for the Clean Development Mechanism. That was really exciting. There's a lot of young people who we all had this sort of, at Eco Securities, we all had this ethos that we were changing the world, and we're all going to make a career of that. And grew very rapidly. We were at several hundred people. Ultimately, the firm, when I left, I was running the U.S. business. We developed probably one of the first portfolios of carbon credits based in the U.S. for the emerging U.S. carbon market as it was at the time. We all expected that there would be a U.S. national cap and trade program. Clearly, California started getting on track in those days, and that was all very exciting. And then the CDM, sort of the demand for the CDM really went away, largely because of what was happening in Europe. And I moved then to really focus more on the U.S., the emerging U.S. market, and especially California, and broaden out to look at a broader suite of ecosystem services. So I went to work for a firm called Equator. We raised a ecosystem services focused fund. We did actually some of the real pioneering investments in biodiversity projects. This would have been back in what, sort of 2010 through 2012 timeframe. We invest a lot in mitigation banks in the U.S. And of course, forest carbon. Carbon has always been there for me in my career. Invested that fund and then moved to another firm called Echo Asset Management. We raised another and deployed another carbon fund focused on forest carbon. And then we merged with Wolfenson Fund Management, which was the private equity firm of James Wolfenson, who was the president of the World Bank and had left, and created Encourage Capital, which was one of the pioneering early impact investing firms. And there we had I thought was, and I still think is a really innovative idea, which really inspired where I am right now. And that idea was, instead of doing hammer and nail like many investors think, right? I've got a tool, I've got a fund, I've got debt, I've got equity, whatever it happens to be, and I'm going to look for opportunities that fit that tool, right? We said, why don't we do it the other way? Why don't we look at the challenge, whatever challenge we want to address, and then create a financing solution to meet that challenge, to scale private capital in the service of the environment and impact. And that got me thinking of two things, and this brings me to where we are today. One is, how do we really move the needle on reversing global tropical deforestation? I had spent, in those two funds that I was managing, I spent a lot of time thinking about how could I invest, and I did invest in a lot of forest carbon projects. I spent a lot of time thinking about how we could invest in forest protection, red plus at the time. And there just wasn't enough demand to underwrite the protection thesis. And so I set out thinking, how could we really create a large demand driver, a demand pull for red plus, right? So, which is essentially reducing emissions from deforestation and forest degradation. So essentially forest protection. And created a blended finance vehicle, had concessional capital, raised some money from the Rockefeller Foundation in a seed grant. We wrote a white paper. I had investors, I had buyers, I had the concessional lined up with actually US, UK, and Norway at the time. We ran into Brexit with the UK, ran into Trump 1.0, both which derailed that. And Norway, to their credit, said, look, and this would have been probably around 2016. Norway, to their credit, said, look, this is an idea that needs to happen, and we're willing to underwrite the launch of this, but it really should be a nonprofit. And so we launched it as a nonprofit with the idea that we needed the theory of change of Emergent, which is the nonprofit that we created, is to build a market, a robust commercial market for high integrity jurisdictional red credits. And so since then, we've we launched our main initiative, which is called the Leaf Coalition, and we've been able to raise over $1 billion of commitments through public-private partnership that includes 3 donor governments, Norway, of course, and now we've brought UK and the US is in still. And then we have over about 30 large multinational companies who've committed to purchase carbon credits through the Leaf Coalition. So that's really exciting. We're deploying that. We've done 4 transactions to date with Leaf. We've done Ecuador, Costa Rica, Ghana, and the state of Pará in Brazil. We've got several more in the line. We're waiting for the first credits to be issued. So that's really exciting. And then the other thing, going back to the Encourage Capital days, where I was kind of thinking about the hammer nail thing, I said, this was a moment where divestment was on the radar, okay. and how do we get institutional capital and endowments and the like to divest of fossil fuels. And that got me thinking, well, if they're going to divest, we should give them climate aligned investments that they can deploy large, they can deploy at scale. That's liquid, and that provides a alternative to, let's say, traditional public equities. And so it struck me that compliance carbon, different than on the red side, which is more on the voluntary or offset side, but compliance carbon markets are mature, are now mature markets. We're maturing at the time. We have a market in Europe which is approaching, let's say, well, collectively, not, close to $1 trillion of traded volume across these compliance markets. Europe being the largest, and then California and the 10 states in the Northeast, Reggie, and UK and others. And so, but there really was not an effective way, if you were an investor, whether a retail or institutional, there really wasn't a way to access those markets easily.
Mhm.
And so that then led us to create an ETF that we listed on the New York Stock Exchange. We actually brought John Kerry in before he went back to the White House to be the climate czar. And we were on the floor in the New York Stock Exchange during COVID, ringing the bell and launching, a carbon ETF. And the idea there was basically sort of like I think of it like an S&P 500 tracker that can track the largest and most mature carbon markets. And so it was one of the fastest, and we launched it in 2021. It was one of the fastest growing ETFs on the New York Stock Exchange at that time. So over about $1.7 billion of money had been invested in it, and it's still there. It's since inception, it's still beating the S&P 500 index, and so and subsequently we've launched other Europe only and a California only fund. So so that continues, and we keep moves on. So I'll stop there. That was a lot, but
I
been a long
mean,
journey.
hearing this, like some of the things I'm thinking about when hearing this is like, okay, there's actually a pretty comprehensive set of financial strategies you've helped implement here. The Leaf Coalition, increasing demand side for jurisdictional red, KRBN for, alternative to divestment. Um, it sounds like been involved in private facilities for different things. Like these are some pretty ambitious plans. And yet, when I see sort of the rate of deforestation or sort of just like public perception around forest protection or conservation or voluntary carbon credits today, I'm not in the position where I'm like, oh yeah, it's all working perfectly and we're definitely going in the right direction. And in the next couple years, I can see these instruments hitting multi tens of billions of dollars or hundreds of billions of dollars, which would be needed in order to address the full scale of the ecological and climate challenge. Like back of the envelope, I often estimate $500 billion a year going into forest protection and restoration would be like full 30 by 30 or very, very large successful meeting of these, UN targets that we have. So even though individually these facilities have been more or less successful, like what needs to happen in order for us to go from here to there? And also when I hear like, oh, 2010, first, biodiversity focused investment funds, forest carbon, it feels pretty similar to 15 years later. I don't know if that's your read, but what needs to happen today to get us where I think we need to go?
Yeah, no, it's a great point. And look, with Leaf, we've been able to get over $1 billion of commitments. Nice pat on the back, and that's probably that's the largest public-private partnership focused on reversing deforestation. Feels great, congrats. But like that's a drop in the bucket. That's $1 billion over 5 years. We need $5 to $10 billion every year, right? So we tell ourselves this is just the beginning. And I think, so that's exciting. And when you look out at what could happen and the potential, there's a lot of room there. Now, in terms of what needs to happen, I've thought a lot about this. And I think there are a lot of really good, dedicated people in this space, many of which may be listening to this podcast. But we have a tendency as a community, as a carbon market and environmental community writ large to really get lost, I think, in the details and get lost very quickly into, okay, we have a new mechanism, let's say, for generating carbon credits for jurisdictional red. It's a new standard, and um, and then we assume that the demand is going to come, okay, but for integrity, but for designing the perfect methodology,
Yeah.
but for
Just one
making
more
sure we
registry will solve the
one more
problem here.
registry,
Uh-huh.
exactly. And what we have not focused on as a community is helping to drive and build the business case for demand. It just
Mhm.
has, there's not enough focus on that. If you ask yourself, what NGOs, what advocacy groups are focused on creating the demand? I mean, it's very,
Yeah.
very few. Most of them are focused on, and by the way, philanthropies are partly to blame for this, because this is, NGOs are doing what philanthropies want to fund, and so there's just not enough focus on where is this demand going to come from ultimately. And so let me answer that question: like, where is this demand going to come from? Like,
Yeah, I was just
ultimately,
gonna say, like, okay, we've got an audience right now of a lot of the people who need to come together to form the whatever demand side coalitions that are needed. Like, what's the playbook here?
so ultimately, I mean, there's two things here. Ultimately, we need what we need regulation, right? That's ultimately. So we need to support the, but and there's a technical question around that, and then there's a social movement question around that. We need regulation, and then we need robust voluntary action. We need to support the business case for robust voluntary action, and so, but both of those, in my view, we need to we need a simple and effective message as a community that cares about climate, not just carbon markets. In fact, I would say, let's all leave our, like, let's walk in this door together. Let's leave our carbon market, baggage on the doorstep, and let's walk in and say, what needs to happen is not fixing the carbon market. That will come later. What needs to happen is we need, and here's the message I think that we
Hmm.
need to get, is the era of free emissions, of emitting greenhouse gases into the atmosphere without a cost, right, is over. That needs to be over. We need to demand that as a social movement, that the expectation to operate in the world as a serious company or organization is, you're no longer using the atmosphere as a dumping ground for pollution for free. Okay, if you need to emit greenhouse gas emissions, we understand that, because we don't have all the technologies. I mean, people aren't, people need to fly, people need energy, and we don't have all the technologies yet. And so, in this transition period, as we're transitioning, as we're decarbonizing, as we're inventing the technologies, um, every ton needs to be paid for. So every ton, I mean, I call it every ton, every time, and
Hmm.
and to me, that only happens if there's a change in norms and a change in social movements. And so how do you? I mean, that sounds great,
Yeah,
Aaron.
I
Like,
want to go into that a little bit because just to reflect what I heard. So one step is regulation, and regulation is like, okay, the technical laws and how the rules work, but the other is the political and cultural will to go do it. And then there's, let's say, robust voluntary action. And so what we're talking about right now is like all we can make a good set of rules. Like I
support
bet between
it,
the two,
it
right,
supports
the two
both
of
of
us
those.
could probably make a good set of rules, like
Right.
but the will to do it, I would say, like, on polling around carbon taxes, for example, like these are very currently unpopular efforts, even though everyone's like, hey, yes, sustainability, but carbon taxes, that sounds like, you know, it doesn't sound like a good thing. I'm going to make less money. So, what is needed to catalyze? I could go repeat those slogans all over. Yeah, a ton every time. But what's needed to change that perception, or what's needed to get to that level of will? Is it just more crises? You know.
Look, I think, I mean, maybe more crises, but look, I think, let's start with the community that we have, right? We suffer in this community, meaning carbon, climate, and broadening out into environmental. From a however you want to, whatever analogy you want to use, a circular firing squad, we get lost in the details. We don't have consensus on what is a key, like what is a drum that we can all bang at the same time. We're caught up in technical details around little, owning little areas of this, maybe shrinking pie or whatever. And we're not focused on. And so let me say. So imagine, let's do an exercise. Imagine you had the community. I mean, this is a message, right? Like that all emissions should be paid for. Like, who can argue with that? We've got still about 75 to 80% of emissions that are still going into the atmosphere completely for free, right? 40 to 50 gigatons going into the atmosphere completely free.
Yeah.
We're 30 years more into this climate crisis, and we're still at this stage. So how, if we really believe climate is an emergency, first I'm talking to those converted, right? Let's get on the same page, and let's say whatever you think, like let's at least agree that every ton we're at a point where every ton should be paid for. Okay, then you start there. And I think then you want to look at the next sort of concentric circle of the general public who are maybe not hostile to climate. I think they all understand that pollution shouldn't be free intuitively. You don't throw out garbage, for free. You've got to pay for waste. All right. So pollution is not, should not be free. And then, so I want to go back also to,
I actually, maybe as a thought experiment, I actually really like what you just said. Like, people pay for garbage pickup, right? And that is a different thing than saying, hey, you're offsetting your garbage cost, and so there's a right to pollute. Like, no,
Exactly.
It's not a right to pollute. You're paying for garbage pickup. And it's the same analogy. And that, honestly, I've never heard that analogy before, and I'm going to use it because that's sort of an intuitive thing of like, yeah, I pay like $50 a month for this little, garbage can, or sorry, 50, I think it's $50 a week. And then like, that adds up pretty fast. Actually paying for your, atmospheric pollution should be the same. It's just, it's harder to containerize it. So you have to go through a bit more complex system, to actually, have it routed somewhere else.
But I think you're absolutely right, Troy. And I think we have to get away from the carbon markets in the sense that we can't see the forest for the trees, to use that. Right? It's like we're so focused on how do we grow the carbon market. No, my point. I care about the carbon market. I want to see that grow, and I think it can deploy lots of capital and so. But the point is, forget about that for a moment. The key, if the only thing we did, right, as a community was get every ton to be paid for and internalizing that cost, changing the cost of doing business that incentivized clean green investments, and you took that money and you did nothing with it, right? So whatever it is, $20 a ton, you took all that money and you buried it under a mountain or whatever, we would still be ahead of the game on the changing the incentives of doing business. Now you have an opportunity, once you've unlocked this money, to say, what can we do with it? And to be honest, I would say as long as it's going into positive climate action, we should be happy with that. And I think carbon markets, then you're unlocking so much money. I think carbon markets come out very well. You say, okay, but it might be, you might want to deploy that into clean green investments, insetting, climate philanthropy, and then carbon markets, right? And get away from, I think where we're suffering from also, I think we need the accounting, but I think we're suffering from this one-to-one and the obsession around measuring to the last ton. And have we met, because we're really obsessed with it, by the way, on the offset side. It's much less obsession on the actual carbon accounting side, although there is some. I mean, those carbon footprint accounting relies on a lot of factors and assumptions, and it's hard. So let's get away from that and let's focus on, okay, let's pay for every ton and then figure out what are the, so the idea that I have then is like pay for every ton. And then you could have, you don't need a big governance structure. You can say, okay, what is a minimum price that's credible to pay for every ton? Maybe it's $20 per ton to start, and goes up 5% a year or whatever you want. That's a and then what are the credible ways that you can deploy that money? Carbon markets, climate philanthropy, reinvesting to clean green technologies. You can imagine a whole bunch of things, right? So it doesn't have to only be carbon markets, but carbon markets, I think, would be. You can even think about that. You could even imagine that there could be a tier system, right? Maybe there's
Hmm.
a hierarchy of things, and carbon markets would be at the top of that hierarchy. Okay, we can worry about that later. But my point is, we're at a point, I think, where we need to bring this community back and say, all get on the same page and say every ton needs to be paid for, and that's what we want. And so, I'll just finish with this point.
Please.
That helps. That helps with the regulation, because if we can get this social movement going, it gives the policymakers the backbone to actually introduce the regulation that we need. But it also mobilizes the voluntary, because what you're saying is, if you are a company operating, and you want a social license to operate, the table stakes to be a serious company is to pay for every ton. And if you look back at a few years ago, when a lot of companies were signing up for the net zero, I get asked a lot, like, Eron, why did all these companies, a few years ago, 2021, 23, like, why did all these companies sign up for net zero? And there's not one reason. It's that there were lots of different forces on these companies. Some of you
It's
might know,
kind
like
of
Mike.
like that's what you do. I don't think there was even a financial justification of like, okay, here's the marketing claim we'll be able to make, and then we'll be able to sell more products, and then we'll be able to continue to operate, and it's de-risking the future. I don't even think it was about that. I just think like it was a cultural shift and a moment where just like, hey, this is what you do, and I want to be one of the good guys on the planet, so I'm going to do this too. And the individual
Exactly.
decision makers of those companies just said, this is what you do. This is what it means to be a human being on Earth, to be a responsible person that takes care of my kids. But somehow, right now, I don't feel like that is the consensus cultural statement that we're making, which is, hey, I am caring for my children by caring for the planet, and this is how you care for the planet, and it's associated with, paying for every ton.
Well,
That's not the feeling that I get.
no, for sure. Let me give you some hope there. Which is, the pendulum swings back and forth. The tide, wherever,
Okay.
and the tide comes in and out. It's like I've been in carbon for nearly 25 years now. This is the third or fourth boom bust cycle. The only thing that's different is the depth of the of the valleys, and the height of the peaks just get more higher. So it's becoming more volatile, right? So this will come back, right? In other words, whether it's a set of disasters or whether it's a reaction to the Trump era or whatever it is, it will come back. And my point is, this is the time to build. This is the time to think about what is the right framing that we want, that's ready to go when this does come back, because you can't predict when it will come back. So you need to. So my point on the net zero thing is, my read is not, it's not just a kumbaya. In my view, I mean, there is some kumbaya, like, this is what we want, this is how we want to be as humans on Earth. But if you look at why companies do anything, it's because they've got forces that, Michael Porter, a famous business school professor from Harvard, says, there's 5 forces that are on companies, right? Customers, clients, supply chains, regulators, etc. And they react to those forces. And I think there was a confluence of forces that were acting on companies during that phase that were saying, do something on climate, right? Customers were asking, supply chains were asking, their employees were asking, business school recruits, top business school recruits were asking, regulators were asking, right? We had SEC transparency rules coming down. So it wasn't one of these things. It was the confluence of company boards saying, okay, well, there's a lot of noise on climate. What should we do? They turn to the CEO and say, what are we doing about this? And then there's a little NGO at the time who happened to be well positioned, right? Science-based targets, like, okay, that sounds good. Net zero, this is the theme. Good. Without even thinking about it, right? Like, and it wasn't necessarily fit for purpose. It wasn't really, and we're, and so all those commitments were made. And my view is now is the time to build what that next thing is. So when those forces come back, those confluence of forces come back, I think we want to be ready with something that unlocks even more capital and more action. And I
Yeah.
think that the net zero is great, SBTI is great, but the weakness is it's forward looking, and there's really not a lot of accountability on that path. Whereas if you can
Yeah.
say every ton needs to be paid for, you have a current way of looking at what you do this year, right? Have you paid for your ton?
Yeah.
So that's kind of a that's my my soapbox there.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for this. I mean, I have a lot of thoughts, but maybe just relating this to Earthshot and what we're doing. I never wanted to be in carbon markets. It was sort of like, this is it feels like almost the perfect mechanism, but not quite. It was really like identifying the goal. Okay, restoring and protecting nature at planetary scale. Like that's something that I can get behind, and it's highly correlated with climate action. But there's sort of my own personal motivations really around restoring and protecting nature. And carbon markets, like, okay, here's the mechanism that seems like the most suited for purpose, even though it's not perfect. At least there's sort of like a regulatory pathway and a demand side, where then there's a financial pathway to direct the money, and then there's a clear set of claims you could make around, biodiversity and climate impact. And it's like, okay, I could see how that can evolve over the next 10 years. Um,
Hmm.
and it's sort of like our position right now is like, okay, independent of the up or down swing, we just need to be there. So when there is an upswing, that the infrastructure to be able to support that increase in demand curve is there. So we don't have to wait for the next demand swing to take advantage of it, but actually, oh, you want to go deploy $1 billion into climate? We have the rails for that.
Mm-hmm.
And but we can't really push the string, or you can push it a little bit. Like you can push the cultural string or like the hype cycle string a little bit, but it's more like, hey, we're waiting for the true underlying rising tide, and unfortunately, the rising tide is probably, increasing the number of hurricanes that hit Florida every year, and maybe rising temperatures in really large cities in southern Europe. That's like, oh wait, that's actually a real financial cost to a lot of people, a real human cost. Okay, suddenly the risk adjusted return is there, the cultural movement follows, and then the rails exist to actually deploy that capital and have it be done in an equitable way.
Makes
So
sense.
that's sort of like, okay, that's the Earthshot thesis. And talking to you, I wonder if there's a way for us to push the string a little bit,
Mm-hmm.
and like, okay, coming together as an industry and be like, okay, we have a coherent story that we can tell. There's a coherent set of maybe lobbying actions or like, political influence. And what I've noticed is probably what you're saying, which is it feels like a lot of people go a lot of different directions. And it's not like I can identify, okay, you are the leader, you are the leader, you're the leader that is sort of pointing a unified spear in a single direction. Like that's not how it feels within climate action.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I don't know what's the opportunity here, and okay, you're making a call to action right now. Like, what do people do about that? Is there something that is the next step from that call to action of like, okay, forming a coherent story? How does that coalesce?
It's a great question. So, what I'm trying to do, I'm trying to convene, a set of thought leaders in the space to think about this and think about the viability of this, with a bit of money from philanthropy, and I think there's really two or three components. One is designing as you say, there's not a focal point for this, right? So there needs to be a secretariat or some organization that kind of picks this up, and puts out broad sort of the guidelines around
Mhm.
this, what this actually means if you want to as an organization implement this every time thing. And then second is we need to recruit some of the early movers into this and to say, okay, we're signing up, right? And then third, I think we need real, like, this is about building a social movement, and I think getting influencers, getting marketing experts, communication experts, um, building a consensus around this. And I'll give you, an analogy that I have thought about in this space. And you and I are Americans, and a lot of people listening are probably in the U.S. And health insurance, employee paid health insurance in the U.S. Um, it's not it's not regulated. It's not a requirement for companies to pay it. There's a real cost to companies, right? It costs quite a lot actually for companies. Um, but if they want to be seen as a real serious company, if they want to be able to recruit and retain talent, that's just a cost of doing business. And it's that's not the case in almost any other country, and
Mhm.
so or at least many other countries. And so it's not a perfect analogy, but you could imagine that employees might look. I mean, just one of
Yeah.
the forces, right? You could imagine that companies are saying, because is my company doing something on climate action? Right now, if you are an employee that cares about that, it's very hard to tell if your company is taking some meaningful action on climate, because it's like all over the place. It's like, what is net zero? This is another advantage of this is just simplifying, because people who care need to hook into something that's simple,
Yeah.
right? And so it gives us something simple to hook into.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Maybe just to echo that, I remember a few years ago, there was this whole wave of carbon credit companies that would sell credits to individuals and be like, hey, for 20 bucks a month, offset your carbon footprint. I'm like, I don't believe that is where the burden of responsibility is going to be most effective. Like, that is not the unit of climate action.
Right.
Um, Instead, okay, what are the other units of climate action that are possible? One is at the corporate level, which is like, oh, it should carbon paying for your emissions, should that be at the employee level? For example, hey, for 200 bucks a year, that is a standard benefit that the company offers individuals. Or should it be sort of at the corporate level where actually the company's emissions broadly are calculated, and then that's sort of like a bulk thing where it's kind of like today, like Microsoft, for example? Or should it be at the regulatory country level, which is like, hey, you have to pay for emissions. And
Yeah.
so maybe or even rather than charging it, oh, hey, Microsoft did this much energy, it's actually just point of production, which is if you extract fossil fuels from the earth, you tax that directly. There's no problem with accounting because you just know where the emissions are coming from. There's no other source of emissions. You just tax the point of production because you know it's going to get burned or used for something. That would be like a very easy accounting problem.
Totally.
But instead we push the accounting to millions of individual companies or billions of individual people. That doesn't make sense. It only makes sense if the point of production has enough political power to say, no, 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 this is not our problem. It's actually the users of the fossil fuels rather than the producers. And
Yeah.
so I'm like, there are very easy solutions to measuring emissions, accounting for them, compensating for them. However, the burden seems to be shifted from where it's actually easiest. And so that, I don't know, it seems like there are actually some pretty simple, so like I'm sort of always an advocate of like point of production emissions tax, or basically like pay for the, at the point of production. And then okay, then you have this, whatever, let's say triage system for where the revenues go, because you have a full revenue neutral system. You don't want to just be like, hey, gas is 10 times as expensive now. No, no, no. It's that your entire net, expenses as a household can stay the same, even though emissions intensive activities go up. Less emissions intensive activities can get cheaper, or you get a, check in the mail. But that could go towards forest restoration, that could go towards subsidies of, green energy, etc. Um, sorry, I was just also riffing a little bit. Talk to me a little bit about this group of people that you're trying to converge, and also there's a lot of secretariats. I also sometimes wonder of like, hey, I was talking to some friends who were starting a new carbon registry and standards body the other day, and I'm like, shouldn't you just get bought by S&P or like live at the UN, or like shouldn't the US government be doing this, or like some entity that has this social validation needed to pull off tens or hundreds of billions of dollars of transactions, and that's not you guys because you're really small. And maybe you can start and then transition or become that. But you'd think the natural thing is like, oh yeah, the UN should do this. But the thing is, the UN is doing this, COPs, but it's not taking in the same way. It's like the UN or the US government or other groups have lost the social contract to be able to act at that level. Um, and so in parallel, it's like we're facing the loss of social contract for the biggest institutions in the world. At the same time, we're trying to like all sort of do it in these little companies like Earthshot, which is like, no, 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 we can replace those big social contracts. And maybe that's not the case. Yeah, I don't know if you
Yeah,
have some thoughts on that.
yeah. So on that, like, the way I envision this every time we don't have to, but the way I envision this is that there's a simple secretariat that's putting out like guidelines and kind of holding I don't know, the leadership on this. And if that makes sense to be at another organization, that's fine if there's one, but it's not taking in money and then deploying money, right? That's for each actor to do on their own. So, and I think you're really astute at like saying at an individual level. And the thing that I like about this framing, this every time, is it's applicable at the smallest level all the way up to the largest level, right? Whereas like net zero doesn't mean anything for an individual. How do I, as an individual, become net zero? It doesn't mean anything. But to use your example, like, yeah, maybe, okay, my emissions are what, let's say 20 tons per year. Okay, I should be, so what the secretary would say, okay, a minimum price you should pay more if you can, but pay $20 per ton. Okay, so I should pay, whatever that is, $400 a ton, $400 over the course of the year. I should pay because of my climate emissions. Okay, the next thing the secretary would say would be what are acceptable ways to use it, right? That are credible. And so buying offsets is one. Investing in clean green. So maybe I go to the hardware store and say, okay, I'm gonna implement I'm gonna pay for hot water solar heater or something like this. Right? So, but that creates action, and it creates action, and then it answers the question like, what can individuals do? Well, the individuals can be subject to exactly the same messaging and same paradigm as the largest organizations in the world. You can imagine a large oil and gas company, same thing, right? Mm-hmm. Take them, you got to pay. And so the secretariat is actually very easy. I think a very easy job. Minimum price, three things. What's the minimum price that's credible? What are the acceptable uses of payment? You do it yourself, right? And then third, kind of like the communications and thought leadership. And so in terms of this group of people that I want to bring together, and I've got an application into a few of these kind of retreat centers, but I want to pull together, like, let's say 6 philanthropies, 6 corporates, 6 NGOs, and 6 influencers, right, into a room and say, to your point, we're going backwards on climate, right? We need to, and this is the time to build for when the pendulum starts swinging back. Here's an idea, and here's an idea that I think can generate consensus among the environmental community. I can't see anyone disagreeing with that every ton should be paid for, right? And coming out of that is it viable? What's needed? What's the project plan? And how do we deploy? Right. And so that's the kind of group that I want to get together. But I'm open. Look, I mean, I've been, and just tying this back to what you're doing and what we're doing at Leaf. Right. And so the way I started thinking about this is, it's very hard. We've got $1 billion, I said, with Leaf and Emergent. I'd like to have 10 billion a year. Where do you get that how do you unlock that kind of capital? How do you create that exponential? Yeah. And we're not on that track right now. And it's very hard to envision with the UN process, with working with, at least the existing state of things, working with the policymakers. It's very hard to see how you get there. And so I think we need an innovative idea where and let's start with getting like those who of us who
Yeah.
are converted on the same page on something, right? It doesn't have
Yeah.
to be this, by the way. This is the thing that I've thought a lot about, and I think this is probably the easiest thing. There may
Yeah.
be a better idea that's out there, but I really
Yeah.
think that we spend so much time as a carbon market community, as an environmental community, as a climate community, arguing about the details, arguing about standards and methodologies and accounting. And I mean, and meanwhile, over here, very few, like, meaning over here is the fighting the battle, the real battle of where unlocking the finance,
Yeah.
where people don't have their eye on the ball. And I'll just make this also last point. I spent a lot of time in impact
Please.
investing and realized that, there is it's not surprising, there's a language difference between environmentalists and people who work in finance. And, they get very excited to connect and work with each other. And the finance people are very eager to create innovative financial mechanisms and, et cetera. And the environmental people get very excited by that. The people in that whole excitement, and I've seen this happen many times, the fundamental piece of where is the revenue coming from? What's the underlying business model? Oftentimes is completely forgotten about,
Mhm.
right? So we got some really fancy financing mechanism,
Right.
but
Someone's got
it's
to buy the credit.
the
Someone's
first,
got to
whether
pay
it's
the
carbon
money.
credits or anything else, it's the first
Yeah.
principles of where does this thing get paid back is we haven't thought about that. And so it's kind of like what we're doing on a macro level. It's we're creating this very complicated voluntary carbon market, extremely complicated, and the banging on integrity, which I'm probably guilty of as well. But uh, and meanwhile, we've got a sub $1 billion market that's probably year on year contracting.
Yeah.
And who is actually fighting the battle of growing that pie?
Yeah.
Right.
I mean, just to tell a quick story on this, so Vera released this new VM47 methodology, years in the making. It's been quite a time since that methodology was released. I've been involved in both projects that have been registered with that methodology. There's not 1,000 or 10, some people think the voluntary carbon market's oh yeah, there should probably be 10,000 projects registered by now. There's been two, and I've been a
Right.
part of both of those. And it's okay, shouldn't there be more? I would have thought there would be a lot more by now if I
Right.
was sort of outside observer. And it is minuscule, and it is complex, and it's time consuming, and it takes a lot of pushing to get one of these things registered. And yeah, they're very high integrity projects. They're excellent. But it's just a very humbling place to realize, yeah, we are working very, very hard as an entire organization and industry on very, very small projects, relatively. And my sense is that we actually have the scientific and financial infrastructure and set of rulemaking needed. If there was $100 billion demand signal, we could make that work. But actually, we're over complexifying a lot of stuff because the demand signal is small. And so we're sort of trying to divide up pieces of a very small pie. And so you really fight with your siblings to try to get a bigger piece. But what if there was 1,000 pies, and you're well, actually, everyone just gets a full pie.
Right.
And then probably there would be a lot less strife in this area.
100%.
Um, so maybe I'm just thinking, sort of taking some of your ideas. It feels like there's an idea that is, and it's not just one idea, but it's the sort of conviction that you have formed in your time and I've formed, that okay, this is something we want to have happen. We want to see nature be restored, protected. We want to see climate action. There's just a level of conviction that is very motivating, that not everyone has felt that strongly, or felt that that's their responsibility, or has had maybe the time to be able to feel that, because they're super busy with their lives. And it's there's an idea that is powerful enough that needs to coalesce our industry and field. And also, I was talking with someone the other day, one of actually our mutual friends, and he was like, "Is there an idea that is good enough that it's like make America great again as well? Like, hey, we've got the biggest redwoods, we've got the biggest bears, we've got the most epic national parks. Like, can it be like the cool kids also want to be a part of this rather than the just sort of like I don't know, the fringy environmentalists like me that want to, oh yeah, we love trees. No, no, no. Trees are epic. Like
Mhm.
there's also a bit of a cool factor that I think is a real deep driver in our culture. And so if I was just to echo your wish here is that it also is really the cool kids that are bought into like, yeah, national parks are epic. We should have more of those. It's not just like I have to be open-hearted and responsible. It's like we get to be epic because of, the work
Mhm.
that we're doing. And that is not the vibe of environmentalism, at least historically.
I totally agree.
Yeah.
Yeah, I totally agree. Yeah.
Well, thank you for this time. It was really, always a pleasure to talk to you, and I really hope we get up to something together. But is there anything you wanna leave, the folks listening with right now, or anything you have going on right now that might be a way to be involved?
No, look, I mean, I think you guys are doing great work at Earthshot, and congrats on all the progress that you guys have made, and really excited for what you've got going on, and just echo your point. Like, hopefully, we can work together. And look, I think I've gotten in this for the same reason you have, which is nature and really biodiversity, like the wildlife is
Yeah,
what
like
really.
jaguars are epic,
Yeah.
macaws are
Yeah.
epic, it's like why would we want to just see them disappear? It's totally unnecessary.
Oh, and I know you've done a great job at this. I need to do a better job, but like getting into the field yourself to nurture that and getting other people into the field to experience that and experience the power of nature and wildlife, I think is so important. How do we do more of that? And I'd love to see, love to do that with you and others on this call. Like, let's get out into nature, man, and let's,
Yeah. So
appreciate and
maybe
enjoy it.
last
Thank
sort
you.
of
Yeah.
intention setting. So this group you're pulling together, let's have it be something where people can reconnect to that conviction and also like see each other's souls. Like, okay, I know you have that level of conviction. I have that level of conviction. All of the sort of nitty gritty details about how we get it done, the financing mechanisms, like, yeah, we'll deal with that. But the idea itself and the level of relational connection between us is strong enough that like, okay, we're on the dream team now, and that feels really good. And we can rely on each other. And even if we're competitors, like what does that even mean in this space? I really hope that for the group you're pulling together and that sort of relational field, because honestly, that's also how I believe this happens. And like, okay, our biggest like sales contracts with huge companies, it's also a personal relationship. They're like, I trust you to represent our organization with a with integrity and honesty. And, you love the same things that you do. And I love my kids. And, these deep relationships go a long way. So, also hope for more of that.
Awesome. Well, Troy, thanks so much. Really appreciate this. Hopefully I'll see you maybe in New York Climate Week.
Possibly. We'll see.
All right.
See you, Aaron.
Thanks so much.
Have
Bye.
a great rest of your day.